Hello. We'll be continuing our analysis of these types of bad faith that Beauvoir introduces us to in the second chapter. Last time we talked about the subman or underling and the serious one. Just a few more things to say about seriousness and the serious man before we get into a discussion of nihilism. So the serious one, if you remember, projects their value into an absolute, and thereby disburdens themselves of having to choose, because they can always say, well, I'm just following the law writ into the universe. So, I have no real choice. I just recognize that this is the objective value and I'm following it, without recognizing or taking responsibility for their role in choosing that value from among others. What happens to the serious one also is that they reduce themselves down then to playing one role as a being in the scheme organized around that value, right? So she says, he dissimulates his subjectivity under the shield of rights which emanate from the ethical universe recognized by him. He is no longer a man who is free and who has to make choices and be for himself, be for itself, but a father, a boss, a member of the Christian Church or the Communist Party. So he completely identifies himself with that role and reduces his freedom to a function of the role that he plays within the scheme he's recognized as being the objective or true one. If one denies the subjective tension of freedom, one is evidently forbidding himself universally to will freedom in an indefinite movement. By virtue of the fact that he refuses to recognize that he is freely establishing the value of the end he sets up, the serious man makes himself the slave of that end, right? So again, the way of saying, well, I don't have a choice, I have to do it because this is the cause, this is what the church tells me, what the political party says, what the company says for me to do if I am the boss, is the example that she gives. In this way, the serious man avoids putting anything into question. The thing to which they have committed themselves becomes unquestionable. It becomes a sacred calf. For the military man, the army is useful. For the colonial administrator, the highway. For the serious revolutionary, the revolution. Army, highway, revolution, productions become inhuman idols to which one will not hesitate to sacrifice man himself. Therefore, the serious man is dangerous. If this value that is projected as an absolute has an all-important value outside of human activity, then the implication becomes that human activity needs to be subordinated to that end or that goal. So not only will the serious ones sacrifice themselves to it, they'll reduce themselves to a mere functionary of the cause, and if need be, sacrifice themselves to the accomplishment of that cause. They'll also sacrifice others. The example of the colonial administrator who's tasked with building a highway, who just throws workers at it to their death, sacrificing them to this cause because that's what the bosses say, or so on and so forth, is the example that Beauvoir uses. It's the fanaticism of the Inquisition, which does not hesitate to impose a credo, that is, an internal movement by means of external constraints. It is the fanaticism of the vigilantes of America who defend morality by means of lynchings. It is the political fanaticism which empties politics of all human content and imposes the state, not for individuals, but against them. So again, seriousness becomes dangerous, because if the serious one is convinced of the universal and absolute correctness of their cause, that it must exist independently of them, then they'll subordinate all ends to it and sacrifice not only themselves, but humanity generally. It makes people into enemies, or it makes people into tools to be used to the achievement of the absolute end, and so on and so forth. She talks about the double bind that the serious one finds themselves in when they do this sort of absolute projection and become willing to sacrifice humanity generally. In order to justify the contradictory, absurd, and outrageous aspects of this kind of behavior, the serious man readily takes refuge in disputing the serious, but it is the serious of others which he disputes, not his own. Thus the colonial administrator is not unaware of the trick of irony. He contests the importance of the happiness, the comfort, the very life of the native, but he reveres the highway, the economy, the French Empire. He reveres himself as a servant of these divinities. So it's always, he'll have arguments and disputations about values, but it's always other people's values that are in question and never his own. So they'll question, the value of the life of the native person under colonial rule, but they'll never question the value of the colonial power itself, of the state, or whatever the case may be. You see this today, like, I've already brought this up, but this sort of race realism that's rampant in certain internet circles among evolutionary psychologists and things like that. They're interested in questioning the values of the social justice warrior and the people who criticize racism and everything like that. These are forbidden questions we can't ask, so they'll dispute those values, but the values of their science are never up to dispute. The value of rationality and the role that it plays in justifying our own prejudices are never taken seriously. So their own position is not up for discussion or dispute. It's always the position of the other that's being disputed. It's always these social justice warriors whose seriousness is to be questioned, and never their own projects of evolutionary psychology or whatever that case may be. Again, it's more of a point directed toward the race realism faction that you find on the internet, on Twitter, and on Reddit, and in other corners of the internet that I'm calling out there. Now, what happens, though, is that the serious man is always... It's fear that leads to this sheltering of their own values. The serious man is afraid that the absolute will crumble and will be exposed as just an artifact of their own projects and commitments in the world. So it's fear that's really motivating this in a way, because the absolute that they've projected in their seriousness anchors them in the world and gives them a meaning and a purpose and a function to which they can abandon themselves and use to deny their freedom and responsibility in the world. And so, of course, they're afraid of that crumbling. They are... it is in a state of fear that the serious man feels this dependence upon the object, and the first of virtues in his eyes is prudence. He escapes the anguish of freedom only to fall in a state of preoccupation, of worry. Everything is a threat, since the thing which he has set up as an idol is an externality, and thus in relationship with the whole universe, and consequently threatened by the whole universe. And since, despite all precautions, he will never be the master of this exterior world to which he has consented to submit, he will constantly be upset by uncontrollable course of events. He will always be saying that he is disappointed, for his wish to have the world harden into a thing is belied by the very movement of life. Enemies all around. Everything is a threat to this absolute value. Any outside viewpoint, anyone who questions it, again, that's why other people's values can be questioned, but not mine. It's not quite a faith, because in a certain sense, faith is supposed to allow us to rest easy. So it's not quite like a faith, because, again, it's filled with this worry and anxiety. Everything is threatening to it. There are enemies all around. And the more sort of vague and unspecified the threat is, the sort of greater it appears to him. It's just this generalized kind of like, the world could collapse at any moment. This, of course, is always disappointing. And the serious person is always disappointed because the world won't live up to the absolute ideal that they've committed themselves to. Something is always wrong, and the world is always in a state of disarray because it doesn't meet the pristine order and of their ideal, that can lead to nihilism. So this failure of the serious sometimes brings about a radical disorder. Conscious of being unable to be anything, man then decides to be nothing. We shall call this attitude nihilistic. The nihilist is close to the spirit of seriousness, for instead of realizing his negativity as a living movement, he conceives his annihilation in a substantial way. He wants to be nothing, and this nothing that he dreams of is still another sort of being. Nihilism is disappointed seriousness, which has turned back on itself. So rather than seeing that negativity as the seat of their potential into which they can develop, the nihilist posits nothing as a kind of being, that they can be nothing. So they become destructive. Rather than setting up and projecting an absolute value into the world like the serious one does, the nihilist becomes sort of against everything. They become a kind of anti-value that has ossified or solidified itself into a kind of a being, rather than seeing negation as part of the process of self-overcoming and transcendence in time. At first they cast themselves into the world, sometimes even with a largeness of spirit. They exist, and they know it. So again, there's that double movement of bad faith, where the nihilist can't avoid throwing themselves into the world entirely, but they do so in a sort of fit of destruction. And there again, she references the state of deception. A man maintains a sort of affection for the serious world. They take their nihilism seriously, so to speak. They're projecting a kind of absolute value, but it's an absolute value emptied of all content. It's just negation as such, to become destructive. So I think I'll stop this particular video there with this description of nihilism, the one who negates sort of absolutely. In the next few pages, Beauvoir is going to talk about some artistic movements and the way that they play or engage with nihilism or disorder in a certain way. So we'll discuss nihilism in relation to these artistic movements, and then we'll move on and talk about the adventurer. The nihilist is a very robust sort of topic here, because the nihilist gets something right. The underling or the subman and the serious one are lying to themselves about the nature of their freedom in a little more sort of thoroughgoing way. They do not want to own up to the power they have, which lies in their negation. Remember that existentialist idea that we are what we are not, and we are not what we are, that the very foundation of consciousness is in this act of negation. The serious one and the underling or the subman want to ignore that and cover it up and hide it from themselves. The nihilist gets it. The nihilist understands the nothingness that lies at the heart of being, in a way, but they falter on it. They allow it to stop them. They don't recognize the potential that springs from that nothingness. So Beauvoir has a lot to say about nihilism, because she recognizes within it a kernel of truth, that they're close. They're approaching an important recognition of their freedom, but they stop short and reside in the negation. They become fixated on annihilation and negation, rather than understanding the negative as this very seat and ground of possibility, that their freedom springs from this negation, right? So they feel trapped by the negative, in a sense. So Beauvoir views nihilism, and one of the reasons why she talks about artistic movements and their relationship with nihilism is because she sees that there's a kind of truth within it, that the nihilist gets an important element of what existentialism is trying to show us, but again, it doesn't take the next step. It doesn't complete that journey, and it becomes locked or fixated within this nihilistic space, within the space of negation. So we'll pick up there in the next video, and I will see you all then.